Have you ever walked past a street musician and wondered, who were you before the world stopped listening? This is the story of a man who once graced the world's grandest stages, only to vanish into silence, until one day, someone heard him play again. What followed would stun the music world, and change lives forever. Welcome to The Keys Remember, a moving tale of loss, rediscovery, and the echoes of a genius thought to be gone forever. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, inspire you, or make you think differently about the people we pass every day, go ahead and click that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. And when the story's over, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Otis Lamar's journey spoke to you the most? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Now take a breath, let the noise fade, and listen, because the keys, remember. In the cold corners of downtown Denver, an elderly man plays the piano on the street, ignored by most, noticed by few. But beneath his weathered hands lies a forgotten past, one of fame, heartbreak, and brilliance that once echoed through the greatest jazz halls of America. When a rising star in the music world stumbles upon his playing, a quiet unraveling begins, of history, of healing, and of hidden legacy. The Keys Remember is a story of rediscovery, silence, and the power of music to transcend time. It reminds us that greatness can vanish, but it never truly disappears. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction. Any names, characters, events, or incidents depicted are entirely imaginary and created solely for storytelling purposes. The Keys Remember is intended to provide moral lessons, emotional insight, and artistic inspiration. While it may reflect real-world themes, it is not based on any actual person, event, or place. Viewer discretion is advised for those sensitive to themes of loss and personal struggle. We encourage you to interpret this story in the spirit it was created, with compassion, curiosity, and an open heart. The early light crept through the cracks of Denver's downtown skyline, painting long golden lines across the pavement. The wind was crisp, carrying the scent of roasted coffee beans and cold exhaust. People were already rushing, heels clacking on concrete, phone screens glowing against flushed faces, the usual rhythm of a weekday morning. But just beyond the crowd, near Union Station's front plaza, something else stirred. A man, dark-skinned and dressed in a time-worn wool coat, carefully unlatched the side of a dolly that cradled an old upright piano. Its legs were chipped and the wood had long lost its polish, but the keys, though yellowed, still held their voice. He slid the dolly down with a grunt, resting the instrument gently on the sidewalk. A few passers-by glanced his way, then quickly turned their eyes elsewhere. He unfolded a small stool, sat down, and adjusted his hat, a bent fedora whose ribbon was unraveling. Then, without a word, he began to play. His fingers didn't tremble. They glided, swift and sure, moving through chord progressions with a wisdom no sheet music could teach. The music spilled out like morning light, slow blues with notes that lingered in the air like old perfume. His foot tapped quietly on the cracked concrete, and the melody melted into the rush of the city, becoming part of its heartbeat. Few stopped. A middle-aged man in a business suit slowed down, then kept walking. A young girl tugged at her mother's coat, enchanted, but her mother hurried her along. A food delivery bike buzzed past, drowning out a beautiful crescendo. The man kept playing. Some people knew his face but not his name. Others had seen him before but never listened long enough to care. They called him Mr. Otis. Some thought he was homeless. Others figured he was just another street performer trying to earn enough for lunch. The truth was no one asked. At noon he paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, took a sip from a thermos. Then he played again. The tunes changed with the sun. As shadows stretched across the sidewalk, he shifted into a more reflective tone. Soulful jazz, hints of gospel, even touches of Debussy if you were really paying attention. A few coins clinked in his weathered coffee tin. He nodded in thanks without missing a beat. By late afternoon, a young woman stopped. She wore headphones but lowered them slowly as her eyes narrowed. She stood motionless for almost 10 minutes before walking off without a word. Mr. Otis saw her go but said nothing. His hands continued their work, every note reaching for something far beyond the present moment. Behind him, the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains glowed under the sinking sun. The wind picked up again. Leaves blew across the plaza like forgotten pages of a song. And still he played. As dusk swallowed the city, Mr. Otis packed up his piano the way one might tuck in a child. He locked it gently back onto the dolly, tied the straps with care, and disappeared down the alley behind the train station. The city moved on. But somewhere, among the thousands of people who passed him that day, someone had heard something they wouldn't forget. And the keys, oh the keys, they remembered everything. It was a Saturday afternoon, just cold enough to see your breath in the shade but warm enough to keep the streets alive with movement. Union Station's plaza was dressed in autumn, golden leaves gathered in corners like whispers, and the trees overhead were halfway bare, their branches swaying to an invisible rhythm. Mr. Otis had arrived earlier than usual. He sat at the piano already lost in the flow, letting his hands speak for him. Today's melody had a deeper tone. It was slower, thoughtful, built on minor keys that folded in on themselves, like memories trying to find a place to rest. His music wrapped around the space like a fog, soft, dense, impossible to ignore if you gave it more than a second. A pair of toddlers danced nearby, clumsy and delighted, until their parents called them back to safety. A teenage boy stopped, earbuds still in, but one hand slipped them out without him realizing. He nodded slowly, syncing with the rhythm, then wandered off, changed in a way he didn't yet understand. But still, most of the world passed him by. Except today the world had brought someone else. A sleek black SUV pulled into the valet lane in front of the station. From it stepped Alyssa Hart, tall, poised, effortlessly magnetic. Her long brown coat swayed behind her like a cape. She was in town for a sound check, preparing for a sold-out concert at Red Rocks the following night. A fusion artist, jazz-trained but soul-rooted, Alyssa had taken the music world by storm. She was polished, beloved, and unmistakably powerful in her presence. But in this moment she was just a woman following a sound. She'd meant to grab a courte-à-deux from the cafe inside, nothing more. But the music caught her first. A note floated into her ears as the SUV door closed behind her. It wasn't just beautiful. It was honest. And there was something strange about it, like hearing a voice you hadn't realized you missed. She followed the sound, letting it guide her around the fountain and past a group of tourists taking photos. Then she saw him. A small man, older, his fingers flickering across the keys like candle flames. Her heart stopped. She didn't move closer right away. Instead, she stood at a distance, watching, listening. His phrasing was perfect. Not flashy, not staged, just true. There was a tenderness in his chords, the kind that could only be earned through grief and years and possibly silence. He played as if time didn't exist, as if nothing mattered but the notes unfolding right now. And then it clicked. Alyssa felt it in her spine. She took a slow step forward. She knew this playing. She had grown up studying his records. Back when jazz was still something you had to earn your way into, there had been a name her mentor whispered with reverence. Otis Lamar. A genius of tone and space, someone who could play a single chord that made your chest ache. A man who, decades ago, had vanished without explanation. No farewell concert. No scandal. Just gone. She had spent her youth tracing his melodies, trying to understand the way he bent silence into part of the music. Now here he was, sitting by a train station in Denver, ignored. She couldn't speak at first. She waited for the piece to end. And when it did, the quiet afterward felt like a held breath. She approached, her voice low. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Otis Lamar?" He didn't look surprised, just tired. "Haven't heard that name in a long while," he said without looking up. Alyssa crouched beside him, emotion tightening her throat. "I learned to play because of you." Mr. Otis finally looked her in the eyes. His gaze was steady, full of something impossible to define. "That's so." She nodded. "I thought you disappeared," she said. "I did," he replied. She didn't push further. "Not yet." Instead, she said, "Would you play with me?" He smiled just barely. "You got a piano?" "I have a stage." The words hung between them, delicate but electric. Otis glanced down at his old piano. He touched the top of it like it was a shoulder he didn't want to leave. Then he looked back at her. "I'll think about it," he said. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the Rockies and the first streetlights flickered on across Denver, Mr. Otis sat in a small one-room apartment above a pawn shop on Blake Street. The walls were lined with old books, a dusty record player, and a stack of yellowed sheet music no one had touched in years. The curtains were thin, letting in just enough of the outside world to remind him it was still moving. He sat by the window, thermos in hand, the scent of chamomile rising gently. Across from him, in the corner, stood a second piano, this one covered with a tattered quilt. A grand, once beautiful, now silent. He hadn't touched it in over 20 years. He thought about the young woman with the fire in her eyes. Alyssa Hart. Of course he knew her name. Even if he hadn't followed the charts in years, you couldn't avoid the echoes of someone like her. Her sound was everywhere. Trailers, playlists, even the alley speakers in cafes when the city was quiet enough to notice. She had something real, something sacred, and she'd recognized him. He closed his eyes and leaned back. The past came rushing in. It was the late 1980s when Otis Lamar had been at his peak. Record deals, full halls, a European tour. He'd played for presidents and poets, taught master classes, and recorded albums that were now considered impossible to replicate. But all the acclaim had done nothing to protect him when the world turned. First came the betrayal. A label executive he'd trusted sold his compositions under another name. There was a fight. Lawyers, settlements, ugly things in small print. Then just months later, the worst blow of all, his wife Mara was gone. A sudden aneurysm. No warning. One day she was at the piano beside him, and the next he was alone. After her funeral, he stopped playing. Stopped everything. Otis had left the tour bus parked outside the venue in Philadelphia and never returned to the stage. He wandered for a while, moving from city to city, never staying long. He took small jobs, night shifts, lived simply. The music stayed inside him, but the world never heard it again. Until now. That night, Alyssa sat in her hotel room, unable to sleep. Her bandmates were 2 floors below, probably trading riffs and stories over late-night bourbon, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd witnessed. She pulled out her phone and found an old clip, grainy black and white, Otis Lamar at Montreux in 1986. She had watched this video 100 times. But this time it felt different. The phrasing, the fire, the way he listened to the notes as he played them. It was the same sound she'd heard on the sidewalk. She sat at the edge of her bed and whispered into the quiet, "You're still him." The next morning, Mr. Otis didn't go to Union Station. He walked instead. Up Larimer, across 14th, through quiet blocks of downtown. The city was loud, but he kept his thoughts deeper than the noise. When he reached the park, he sat beneath a half-bare cottonwood tree and watched the pigeons peck at breadcrumbs from a nearby food truck. He could hear music in everything, the soft wheeze of a stroller wheel, the sudden whine of a passing bus, the high-pitched chatter of 2 teenagers arguing about something trivial. It was all rhythm, all part of the song. Otis had spent his entire life listening. But he wasn't sure he was ready to be heard again. That night, Alyssa found him. He was sitting outside a small jazz bar called the Velvet Ember, tucked away in 5 Points. She didn't ask how she knew to look there, it was instinct. That neighborhood had once been the beating heart of jazz in Colorado. If he was anywhere, it would be there. He looked up as she approached. No surprise, just a gentle nod. She sat beside him. Neither spoke for a long time. Then she said, "You don't owe the world anything." He nodded slowly. "But the music," she continued, "the music might still need you." He didn't answer. Not with words. He stood, turned, and walked into the bar. She followed. Inside, the stage was empty, the lights low. The bartender recognized Otis and offered him a slow, respectful smile. Without a word, Otis walked to the piano in the corner. He sat down. His fingers hovered over the keys like they were seeing an old friend again. Then he played. The first note was gentle. Rock. Then came another and another until the silence was gone. He played not for a crowd, not for applause, but because the sound had never really left him. Alyssa closed her eyes, tears quietly slipping down her cheek. The city outside never knew what happened in that little room that night. But something had begun to stir again. The morning after their quiet meeting at the Velvet Ember, Denver woke beneath a silver sky, low clouds hanging over the mountains like forgotten thoughts. In a small recording studio tucked behind a bookstore on Colfax Avenue, Alyssa Hart was supposed to be rehearsing. Her band was already there, unpacking equipment, checking cables, sipping coffee as warm-up riffs filled the air. But Alyssa couldn't focus. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, but every note she struck felt like a pale imitation of what she'd heard the night before. The memory of Otis's playing, bare, intimate, and soul-deep, had sunk into her like rainwater into dry ground. She stood up, walked out of the room, and pulled out her phone. Moments later, her manager's voice filled her ear, confused but curious. "You want to what?" he asked. "I want to add someone to the lineup for tomorrow night. 1 song. That's it." "Who?" She paused. "Otis Lamar." Silence. The manager exhaled. "Alyssa, that's a great story. A myth. But Otis Lamar is gone. If someone's using that name, it's him." "You sure?" "I'm sure." He was quiet again. Then, "If it's really him and he agrees, I'll get the stage cleared." She hung up. That afternoon, Alyssa returned to Union Station. The piano was there, alone, but Mr. Otis was not. A street vendor nearby said he hadn't shown up since the day before. She tried the bar. Nothing. The pawn shop. Nothing. Evening fell. Still nothing. But Alyssa wasn't ready to give up. The next morning, with only one day left before her Red Rocks performance, she returned to where it all began. This time he was there. Mr. Otis stood behind his piano, gloves on, scarf tied around his neck. He was staring up at the sky like he was waiting for something. Maybe an answer, maybe a sign. She approached quietly, but he turned before she could speak. "You're persistent," he said. Alyssa smiled. "You're hard to walk away from." He gave a short laugh, dry but genuine. She stepped closer. "Come play with me tomorrow night. One song. That's all I'm asking." He looked at her long and hard. "You think anyone still wants to hear from a ghost?" "They don't want a ghost," she said softly. "They want you." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at his hands. The joints were swollen, the skin paper-thin, veins like blue ink. They had been his voice for over half a century. He'd buried them in silence. Could he really bring them back into the light? Alyssa gently set a folded piece of paper on the edge of his piano. "The address. Call time. I'll leave it up to you." She walked away. The following night, Red Rocks Amphitheater was a cathedral of sound. The natural stone walls loomed like sentinels, cradling the stage in a vast embrace. The sky above was midnight blue, the stars sharp and still. Over 10,000 people filled the rows, wrapped in scarves and anticipation, waiting for Alyssa Hart. The show began with thunder. Bass, brass, and her signature blend of rhythm and soul poured from the stage like wildfire. She lit the crowd up, song after song, her band sharp and seamless. But beneath the lights, her mind wandered. She scanned the wings. Nothing. She kept playing. The set began to wind down. One more song to go. She stepped up to the mic. "There's someone I want to bring out," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "He taught me how to listen. He taught a lot of people before the world forgot. But I didn't forget." A murmur rippled through the audience. "I'd like to invite him to the stage now." She paused. And then, movement. From stage left, a figure stepped into the light. A hush fell over the crowd. Mr. Otis walked slowly, a little stiff in the knees, wearing a dark blazer, his old fedora resting on his head like a crown. The spotlight caught the lines in his face, deep but dignified. He nodded once to the crowd, then moved to the piano set beside hers. He sat down. No introduction. No words. He played. The first chord was soft. Not weak, soft like velvet after thunder. Then came the second, the third. A descending phrase that felt like night falling gently on the shoulders. Alyssa joined in, her voice barely a whisper, weaving around his notes like silk around stone. The entire amphitheater fell into reverent silence. People forgot to breathe. What they were witnessing wasn't nostalgia. It was resurrection. And for the first time in decades, Otis Lamar's music found its way back into the air, not as an echo from the past, but as something alive, present, and powerful. As they reached the final chord, he let it linger just a breath longer than expected. Then silence. Then the sound of 10,000 people standing to their feet, unable to hold still. Mr. Otis stood slowly, bowed once, then turned and walked off stage. Alyssa's eyes followed him until he disappeared from view. It had been 2 weeks since the night at Red Rocks. Denver's skyline shimmered with early winter frost, the kind that crept across windshields and tucked itself into alleyways. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, fast-paced, indifferent, but under the surface something had shifted. The footage had gone viral within hours. A short clip, a quiet stage, a single spotlight, and the unmistakable sound of Otis Lamar's hands returning to life. Social media exploded. Music forums lit up. "The ghost of jazz has returned," read one headline. "A legend found on the street corner," read another. And then came the flood. Interviews requested, tributes made, producers calling from both coasts. They all wanted a piece of the man who had vanished and reappeared like a whisper that had become a shout. But Otis didn't answer. He didn't return to Union Station. He didn't take the stage again. He didn't speak to the press. He went quiet. In a recording studio just outside Capitol Hill, Alyssa sat across from a journalist from a major music magazine. The lights were hot. The room smelled faintly of pine from a fake holiday wreath above the console. She was tired but gracious. "You said this wasn't a stunt," the interviewer pressed. "But you have to admit it feels curated. A reclusive genius appears out of nowhere and plays a perfect duet at your biggest concert of the year." Alyssa's gaze sharpened. It wasn't curated, she said calmly but clearly. It was a man who never stopped being great. We just stopped looking. The journalist nodded, scribbled something, then paused. Is he coming back? She looked away. I don't know. In the quiet of his apartment, Mr. Otis sat by the window again. The old upright was gone. After the show, Alyssa had sent him a new piano, an ebony baby grand. It gleamed like oil in candlelight, untouched but waiting. A note had arrived with it. You can stay hidden if you want, or you can speak again. Either way, I hear you. He hadn't played it. Not yet. Instead, he'd gone back to something smaller, quieter. He started walking again, through neighborhoods he hadn't seen in years. 5 Points, where the old jazz halls once hummed with life. Baker, where he and Mara had danced barefoot in a rental kitchen after his first review in Downbeat. City Park, where he used to sit and write progressions in the shade of elms. The city had changed. The music hadn't. One morning he wandered into a high school music class. He didn't plan to, just heard a piano through an open window and followed it. A student was fumbling through a Gershwin prelude, rushing the tempo. Otis watched for a moment, then gently knocked on the glass. Mind if I show you something? He asked. The girl blinked, nodded. He stepped in, sat beside her and adjusted her hands. Slowed her pace. Showed her where the silence was supposed to live between notes. The music opened up. From that day on he started coming back. Not to stages, not to headlines, but to the city. To its kids. Its classrooms. Its little corners where music still tried to grow. One evening, Alyssa found a letter slipped under her studio door. It was a folded sheet of plain paper, handwritten in careful, slanted script. You asked if I would speak again. I've decided I will. But not with interviews. Not with cameras. If you want to hear it, you'll have to listen quietly. Like the old days. It was signed, Otis. Word spread quickly in the music world. He was mentoring now. Playing occasionally at community centers. Showing up at jam sessions in basements with bad acoustics and big hearts. Refusing payment. Refusing praise. It became a local legend. If you were lucky enough to sit in the same room as Otis Lamar, you'd leave with your soul slightly rearranged. Then one day his name appeared again, quietly without fanfare, on a concert poster. Alyssa Hart. Featuring a special guest. No mention of who. Just a single line beneath it in small serif font. The Keys Remember. The show was invitation only. Small. Private. Held in an abandoned church in Rhino, converted into a music space with perfect acoustics. Only 50 chairs. No cameras. No phones allowed. Just breath and sound. When the night arrived, those 50 people sat in silence. Then the door opened. Otis walked in, slower than before, his body leaning slightly to one side. But his eyes were wide open. He sat down at the grand piano under the arched ceiling, and he began to play. There was no introduction. No house lights dimmed. No applause to summon the start. Just silence. Then a single note. Deep and resonant, it rose like the sound of a stone falling into a still pond. Mr. Otis held it for a moment, letting it settle into the ribs of the church. The room seemed to breathe with him. The melody that followed was not familiar. It wasn't from any of his old recordings. It was something new, or maybe something that had lived quietly in his chest for decades, waiting for the right room, the right moment to be born. The audience sat frozen. No one moved. No one dared. Each chord felt hand-carved, shaped by years that had not been wasted, only weathered. He played slowly, deliberately, like a man unwrapping something fragile. Each pause carried weight. Each silence between the notes was not emptiness, but memory. Alyssa sat beside the stage, watching from the shadows. Her hands were clasped together in her lap. She hadn't brought her instrument tonight. This was not her story to share, it was his. At one point, during a shift into a minor progression that curled like smoke, Otis leaned his head back and closed his eyes. For a second he looked 20 years younger. Not because the years vanished, but because they were finally at peace. When he finished, there was no applause. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because no one could find their hands. Later, as the chairs emptied and people left in hushed clusters, Alyssa remained behind. She waited until the last guest drifted out the tall church doors and the sound crew had begun to quietly pack up. Otis sat at the piano, fingers resting gently on the keys, not playing, just feeling their warmth fade. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He turned to her with a faint smile. "I know. But I'm glad you did." He nodded. "I thought maybe I'd lost it," he said, eyes drifting to the stained glass above them. "All those years, I kept thinking, What if I never hear it the same again? You didn't lose it, she said. You just stopped sharing it. He looked back at her. That's the part that scared me most. Sharing it again. After everything. You didn't come back for them, she said. You came back for you. He gave a quiet laugh. No. I came back because you asked without expecting. That matters. In the weeks that followed, the myth grew, but not in the way myths usually do. There were no tour announcements. No albums. No guest appearances on late-night shows. Instead, word spread through whispers. If you were in Denver and happened to stop by a certain community center on a Tuesday afternoon, you might find a small room filled with kids learning to shape melodies like stories. You might hear a man with a gravel-soft voice say things like, "Wait, don't rush that silence. It's the most honest part." Some said he gave lessons for free. Others claimed he sometimes refused to speak for days, letting only the piano do the talking. But every so often quietly he would appear. At a gallery, a coffee house, an open mic under string lights. He never announced himself. He never stayed long. But when he sat down and played, everything stopped. Alyssa continued her work, recording, touring, creating, but something had changed in her too. Her music had a new stillness in it. A depth. Not because she was trying to be like Otis, but because she had remembered how to listen more closely to herself. They didn't perform together again. They didn't need to. Once, during a winter walk near Sloan's Lake, she passed by a small gazebo with a worn upright inside. She heard someone playing a familiar progression, warm and wide, like the sun rising through mist. She didn't stop to say hello. She just walked on, smiling, letting the sound follow her a little longer. Mr. Otis never reclaimed the spotlight. He never needed to. The world had found him again. But more importantly, he had found his place in the world. Not in fame. Not in noise. But in the quiet return. Spring came slow to Denver that year. Late snow dusted the foothills well into April, clinging to rooftops and evergreen branches like it couldn't bear to leave. But underneath it all, the city stirred with the promise of new things. Crocuses cracked the frost. Street musicians re-emerged on the corners. And in the stillest places, church halls, music rooms, cafe back patios, the sound of piano drifted like a breeze. In the heart of 5 Points, inside a modest brick building that had once been a jazz club and was now part music school, part community center, the hum of young voices filled the air. Otis Lamar walked slowly through the narrow hallway, a clipboard in hand, a folder of lesson plans tucked under his arm. He moved like he belonged there. Like he had always belonged. He paused outside room 3B, where a small group of teenagers circled a digital keyboard, arguing good-naturedly about chord changes. "Try the diminished seventh," one boy said. "It'll punch harder." "No, that's too much," said another. "Let it breathe." Otis stepped in and raised his hand gently. "How about," he said, "you let the note ask the question before you give it the answer?" The room fell quiet, considering that. Then the boy at the keyboard smiled and played it again, this time with more space, more patience. There it was. A quiet nod from Otis. That was all they needed. In the months since his return, the building had become a small sanctuary. Word had spread, carefully, quietly, that the great Otis Lamar was teaching again. But not everyone could find him. That was how he liked it. He refused interviews. He refused offers to tour again. He even refused a prestigious university's invitation to receive an honorary doctorate. Instead, he asked them to donate pianos to 3 underserved schools in Colorado Springs. He said, "Give them the tools. Don't hand me flowers." One afternoon, Alyssa stopped by unannounced. She hadn't seen him since the night of the church concert. She didn't want to intrude, but something had drawn her there, a kind of ache that only music or memory could soothe. She found him outside in the back garden behind the center, sitting beneath a maple tree with a mug of black coffee. He looked up as she approached. "You again?" he said, not unkindly. She grinned. "Always." They sat in easy silence for a while, the kind that needs no explanation. Then she said, "Do you miss it?" "The noise?" he asked. She nodded. He took a long sip of his coffee. "No, I miss Mara. I miss the way she hummed when she thought I wasn't listening. I miss the sound of the city before the world started shouting. But the music, that's never left." She looked down. "You know, people still talk about that night. They say you opened a door no one thought could be opened again." He chuckled. "Funny thing about doors. They don't lock from both sides." That summer, the school hosted its first ever student recital. Parents packed into folding chairs, camcorders and smartphones raised high, nervous children fidgeting backstage. Otis stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching with quiet pride. When the final performer, a shy girl with her hair in braids and her heart in her throat, sat down at the piano, the room held its breath. She played something original. Hesitant at first, then blooming with confidence. A simple melody, built on soft intervals and delicate phrasing. Otis closed his eyes. It was hers, but it carried his fingerprints too. The crowd erupted when she finished. Otis clapped once, firmly, and smiled. She looked up, caught his eye, and beamed. In that moment, he didn't need a spotlight. He didn't need a stage. He had become the echo in someone else's music. A thread in the fabric of something larger. Years later, people would still ask, whatever happened to Otis Lamar? Some would say he disappeared again. Others would say he was never gone. There would be stories, half true, half legend, about a man who could sit down at any piano in any room and change the air around him. About a man whose silence was as powerful as his sound. But the ones who knew, they'd tell you the truth. He never stopped playing. He just started listening deeper. Because the music wasn't in the fame. It wasn't in the crowds. It wasn't even in the notes. It was in the space between them. And the keys? The keys remembered. The end. Here are 7 moral lessons that can be drawn from the story. 1. Talent never truly dies, it waits to be remembered. Otis Lamar stepped away from the spotlight for decades, not because he lost his talent, but because he lost his reason to share it. The world assumed he was gone, forgotten, faded. But talent, especially one born from the soul, does not evaporate with time. It lies dormant, waiting patiently for the moment when the heart feels safe to open again. This teaches us that it's never too late to reclaim what once set our souls on fire. Whether it's art, love, dreams, or purpose, if it lives in you, it can return. Life may change your stage, but it doesn't change your song. We often measure ourselves by external timelines, thinking we've missed our chance. But the Keys Remember shows us, your chance is still waiting as long as you are. 2. Silence can be sacred. Not all withdrawals are defeats. When Otis vanished from the music world, it wasn't out of failure, it was out of grief and maybe self-preservation. We live in a culture that sees silence as surrender, but this story reframes that. His silence was healing. Reflection. A long breath between notes. We all need those pauses in life. They don't make us cowards, they make us human. The world may not always understand when you step back, when you go quiet, when you disappear for a while to mend the unseen fractures. But those moments can be sacred, necessary. Like the rest in a symphony, they give shape to the sound. 3. True recognition isn't always loud, sometimes it's whispered. Alyssa didn't discover Otis through fame or filters. She found him on a street corner. No fanfare, no press, no spotlight. She recognized his greatness not because of his name, but because of the sound, the honesty of it. This reminds us that the truest recognition comes not from status or reputation, but from deep, intentional presence. When you really see someone, who they are beneath the surface, you awaken something in them that even they might have forgotten. In a noisy world, be someone who listens closely enough to hear the whispers of greatness in others. 4. Sharing your gift isn't about being seen, it's about being felt. Otis had once played in concert halls across the country, his name on records, on marquees. But when he returned, he didn't chase any of that. He played in small spaces, taught in quiet rooms, left when the applause came. The lesson? Purpose is not performance. Your gift is not valuable because it's seen by many, it's valuable because it moves someone. You might reach 10,000 people or just one, but if your presence, your words, your music, your work touches someone, that's enough. That's more than enough. 5. Mentorship is the legacy that lasts. One of the most powerful turns in the story is not Otis returning to the stage, but Otis returning to the classroom. By choosing to teach, gently, patiently, he passed something on. Not just technique, but truth. Not just music, but meaning. This story reminds us that legacy isn't built through accolades, it's built through impact. Through what we pour into others. Mentorship is the kind of immortality that doesn't need a statue or a headline. It lives in the students, the children, the artists who carry your wisdom forward. The truest teachers don't just show others how to play, they remind them why. 6. Healing doesn't happen all at once, but it happens. Otis had lost more than a career. He lost Mara. He lost belief. He lost something inside himself that made music feel worth making. And for a long time that loss defined him. But not forever. Healing is slow. Often invisible. Sometimes it starts with a stranger who listens. Sometimes it begins the first time you play again, even if your fingers shake. This story shows us that wounds can close. Not on command, but in their own time. And when they do, what grows in their place may be something even more beautiful than before. 7. Everyone has a chapter worth listening to, even if the world forgot. By the end of the story, Otis is no longer the man people pass by without noticing. His story becomes known again, not because someone wrote it for him, but because someone heard it. So many people walk through the world carrying brilliance, scars, beauty, genius, and yet go unseen, dismissed by their age, their past, their silence. This story reminds us that every person we pass might hold a history worth honoring. And when we take the time to listen, to really listen, we might discover something unforgettable. The piano remembered Otis, because it was never the world's job to define him. It was always his. Thank you for watching and listening to The Keys Remember. I hope this story touched something in you, whether it reminded you of the power of second chances, the beauty in silence, or the hidden brilliance in people we often overlook. If you enjoyed this journey, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. And if this one moved you, chances are you'll find something meaningful in the other videos here too. Check out the playlist for more inspiring, soul-stirring stories. Don't forget to drop a comment. I'd love to know what part of Otis Lamar's journey resonated with you the most. Until next time, keep listening. Because sometimes, the quietest stories speak the loudest.